Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next installment in our series, Dr. Gilbert Hosts. My name is Dr. Rebecca Gilbert, and I am Chief Scientific Officer at American Parkinson's Disease Association. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will be having a conversation about Parkinson's disease and the African American community. American Parkinson's Disease Association, or APDA for short, is the largest grassroots network dedicated to fighting Parkinson's disease, and we work tirelessly to assist the approximately 1 million people with Parkinson's disease in the United States to live their life to the fullest in the face of this chronic neurologic disease. Please visit our website at apdaparkinson.org to explore all that we have to offer. And this includes programs and services delivered by our network of chapters and information and referral centers located throughout the United States. Our website also hosts a vast array of publications, webinars, articles, and information to help you understand your Parkinson's disease. You can also contact APDA through our toll-free helpline, which is 1-800-223-2732, and via our social media outlets. I would like to thank Genentech and Medtronic for sponsoring this series, and I want to acknowledge their appreciation for the critical need to provide programs like this one to people impacted by Parkinson's disease. My guest today is Dr. Chantale Branson, who is Assistant Professor of Neurology in the Department of Internal Medicine at Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. Her research interests include understanding and improving health disparities among African Americans with Parkinson's disease. Dr. Branson is a medical graduate of Boston University in Boston, Massachusetts, and she completed her neurology and subspecialty training in both movement disorders and sleep medicine at Boston University Medical Center. Dr. Branson is also the recipient of the first ever awarded APDA Diversity in Parkinson's Disease Research Grant, which supports the study of health disparities and/or biological differences among underrepresented Parkinson's disease communities. We want to thank Dr. Branson so much for being with us today to discuss this important topic. Today, we will be talking about those exact issues, understanding both access to care as well as biological differences among African Americans with Parkinson's disease. So we're going to go over a brief introduction, and then we're going to jump right into questions and answers from you, our audience. We've received many questions already during registration, and we also will get questions live during this program. So to begin, Dr. Branson, can you give us an overview of our topic today?
Yes. So thank you again. I want to start by saying thank you to the APDA for having me and for making sure that this topic is discussed. It is a very important topic to me personally and professionally, and I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation. So just to get started about some of the challenges with regards to understanding from the beginning the diagnoses of Parkinson's disease in the African American community all the way to the treatment opportunities that are provided. There have been several studies that have been done. I actually completed a systematic review in 2017 looking at many of the studies determining the prevalence of Parkinson's disease, comparing them to the African American population to the Caucasian population. And the prevalence has been lower among African Americans compared to Caucasians. The question is, with regards to this data that we have collected over a number of years, if the prevalence of the population for African Americans is correct. The issue is that while the prevalence is lower, have we noticed or do we have a problem with the actual diagnosis or a delay in the diagnosis of patients with Parkinson's disease among the African American community? We do notice that there are lower rates of African Americans who are followed under the care of neurologists, who are prescribed newer medications, Parkinson's disease medications. There are lower rates of treatment across the board, all the way from the diagnosis of treatment with something as physical therapy all the way to deep brain stimulation. And there are also lower rates of referral for outpatient rehabilitation services. But we've also noticed that among African Americans with Parkinson's disease, there are greater disability and disease severity based on the time of diagnosis. And this really goes back to, is there a delay in the diagnoses? Because the prevalence is lower among African Americans compared to Caucasians, but the rate of disability is higher among African Americans. So the question is there a delay in the diagnoses and therefore the disease has progressed over time? And so these are a lot of questions that we just don't have the answer to within the research community today. The final question is there a genetic variant with Parkinson's disease within the African American population? That was relatively unexplored. Now, there's a difference. I do want to just take a moment to say, at this time, there's no gene for race. Race by itself, African American versus Caucasian, the systems that have been set up is more of a social system that has been set up based on the race itself. So the question about genetics of Parkinson's disease within the African American population looks more at the geographic locations of African Americans being in a certain region, coming from a certain region compared to Caucasians. So those are some of the challenges that we have. And then we can talk about some of the research that has been done and some of hopefully the future research that we will be doing. And thank you again for allowing me to receive the APDA grant for all to continue this much needed research in this particular field. The research that I will be participating in through the APDA grant for all that I received in July is looking at the demographics of patients with Parkinson's disease at Grady Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. I am on faculty at Morehouse School of Medicine, and through that faculty appointment, I work at a safety net hospital in Atlanta, Georgia. And this particular hospital cares for patients who are underrepresented and underserved minorities. Predominantly, a larger percentage of those patients are of African and Hispanic as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Branson, for that introduction. I think we have our work cut out for us in our discussion over the next number of minutes. So thank you for that. As I mentioned, we have a number of questions that were already submitted as people registered, and we'll start by addressing some of those questions. I'm going to start out here with one of the questions that were already submitted. And this question is from Laura, so thank you very much, Laura. Have you noticed any difference in Parkinson's disease progression in your clinic in women versus men in the African American community? And any thoughts on that differential?
Yes, great question, Laura. Thank you. So I have not noticed a difference among African American men compared to women that is not already shown without including race. So for example, men in general have a higher prevalence of Parkinson's disease compared to women up until a certain age. And then I think it's like over 80, 85. And then that changes, but that's more related to the number of women at that particular age. So I have not seen a progression, meaning a faster or slower progression of men compared to women, if I answered that correctly.
Yes, I think just at this point it would be important to highlight something that you mentioned in the introduction, which is that we're looking at two different things here. One is the social element to the way healthcare is set up in this country, which is certainly a very important conversation that we'll explore today. And then there's the biological differences that may or may not be relevant at all, considering how similar biologically people are, regardless of their skin color. And this reminds me of my clinic, which is in an inner city as well, but it probably treats a wider range of people from various parts of the world. So I'll see people from Asia, Africa, Europe, South America. And what's striking is how similar people are, even if they come from a background. So I think we do have to keep that in our minds at all time. We don't want to be splitting people into tiny little groups, but we do want to acknowledge that there may be some things to work out and appreciate, but overall people are very much the same inside. So we want to highlight that as well. So one question, to get back to some of the points that we were talking about before, is have you noticed in your clinic, you did mention that there is this tendency for people to be diagnosed later and maybe have more advanced disease. Have you noticed that in your clinic? How has that manifested itself in terms of the stage of Parkinson's that you tend to see?
Yes, thank you for that question again. So actually, I joined the faculty at Grady in 2018. So it's been about 2 years since I've been a part of the faculty there. And what I have noticed is that, interestingly enough, the patients that I have seen have a mild progression. But that doesn't mean that the patients that were seen previously before I joined were not diagnosed later. And that's what we're looking at in that grant with regards to the APDA Grant for All. Because, of course, now that I'm here, people know that I'm here. The institution has been very supportive with getting the word out and bringing patients to see me. Then we are seeing a much more mild disease progression. We don't see the very advanced patients as I thought I may have, because I am the first movement disorder faculty with a movement disorders clinic there. But we're actually going to do additional research going back to 2014. So from 2014, 2018, we're also going to look to try to see if we can find a pattern similar.
Fascinating. So I think you don't know what you're going to find unless you look for it. And I think that's one of the lessons of research in general. And so if we're not looking in the African American community for answers, we're not going to find any. And so that's how we have to start. So thank you for taking up this research project. We have a number of questions related to African American participation in clinical trials. So one person asked, what is your opinion about participation in clinical trials? We have another question that came in from a physical therapist that she has noticed there's a low participation in exercise trials with African American participation. What are your thoughts on that? And what do you talk to your patients about that topic?
Yes, thank you again. This is a great topic. So I'm going to take some time to really answer this question because there's multiple layers to it. The participation concerns are likely multifactorial, meaning there are different ways to look at it. So the first is what we often do as providers, we may ask a question. I'm going to segue a little bit into the research topic, and then I'm going to get back to that question, but they may ask a question like, do you want to do research? And that looks totally different for so many different people. And the history behind it may also look different. So if you're talking to a certain group of people about research and they have an experience or they think about other experiences from the past, for example, the Tuskegee experiment or the Henrietta Lacks, I wouldn't even call that an experiment, but those types of that history that certain ethnic groups have, we have to be more intentional about what we're asking people to do. There are two ways we can do it. In addition to saying, do you want to do research? Maybe instead of saying just, do you want to do research, we can define or ask them what we really want them to participate in. Hi, I'm doing this particular study looking at this particular issue within the community. And I'm thinking that exercise is a very possibly protective or maybe even reverses the progression of Parkinson's disease. And I want to look at that more thoroughly. And what are your thoughts, or would you be interested in talking with our coordinator about participating in this particular activity? And so actually defining research for the 21st century, because people have various different perspectives with regards to their past and some of the past problems and issues that we've had previously. And another perspective would take is acknowledging those pasts and saying, would you like to do research? This research looks different. This is not the research that we did in the 50s or 60s. This is what we do now. These are the protections that we have placed at any time. You don't have to be a part of this particular research. You can opt out of it. There's no parameters or anything for you to participate in this. So when we're talking about people being a part of these physical therapy or activities or communities, we have to first define, even the first question is, were they asked? What's the question asked? I'm also looking at patients. I did a patient survey with the participants that I'm looking at, and I asked them the question, were they asked to be a part of Parkinson's disease research? And many of them said no. And then I asked, well, would you be interested in what that would look like? And we would give 3 different scenarios, and over half said yes. So are they being asked? How are we asking those questions? How are we asking them to be a part of the physical therapy, to be a part of the exercise, to be a part of the programs that we're looking and interested in inviting them to be a part of? So I think that for my research, my ultimate research, we have a lot of studies looking at the patient's perspective, the patient's aspect. What we don't have is understanding the provider side or aspect of how do we become more intentional about asking the question and then making sure that they have an understanding of what we are asking and making sure that that understanding is communicated effectively. There's a resident that I was working with last week, and we were talking about his language. He's from Eastern Asia, and they have the same word, but it has 3 different meanings depending on the tone. So there could be the same word with 3 different meanings based on the tonal. He says it's a more of a tonal language. So the tone means everything in certain communities and how we speak it, but also defining and explaining to them what that looks like and what that means. Because research, just saying, do you want to do research, or do you want to be a part of this physical therapy program, or do you want to be a part of this? That may mean different things when they hear it, but if you can provide a simple definition and to show them other participants that are just like them that may benefit from this, it's, I think, the way that we should start to think about these concerns or issues.
Right, you make some excellent points, which is that it's not just going to happen. So participation in research for any person is not going to happen. There has to be the right explanation, the right amount of time spent, and really delving into any concerns or questions. It's not going to be straightforward. And if you think it's going to be straightforward, you're not going to succeed. So you really do need to be intentional, as you said. And I think that really goes to the crux of it.
One more thing I just wanted to add. It also, you may have to come back to the question again. It's not just a one-time thing. Do you want to do research? Do you want to do this physical therapy program? Do you want to be a part of this? And then you stop. Especially now as physicians, we're all very busy. And so sometimes we just say, hey, do you want to do this? And sometimes we have to come back again and just make sure that they are aware and can communicate effectively, that they understood it. So that's important as well.
Absolutely. We have a question here, trying to figure out how to incorporate a bunch of questions in one, which is basically, is there differences in incidence of Parkinson's disease based on a person's ability to see a Parkinson's disease specialist? That is, if you live in a rural community and you don't have access to a Parkinson's disease specialist, is that going to affect your diagnosis? And how do we take that into account when considering prevalence of the African American community?
Yes, yes, and yes. So yes, there is a difference in the incidence of Parkinson's disease, just to make sure that I'm answering this correctly, based on the basis of seeing a movement specialist. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So absolutely. There have been several studies that were done and shown that the diagnosis is confirmed earlier or sooner. They have better care, better outcome, a delay or less likelihood of increased risk of mortality or morbidity. So yes, that is important. And that's the other thing that I think we also have to do as providers. We have to start to develop these connections and relationships early on. Often we're in our own neurology world, and I love the world of neurology, I do, but sometimes we have to branch out and make connections with the entire internal medicine department or the chair or the chief to just let them know that, because we rely heavily, as a clinician movement specialist, I rely heavily on referrals to my clinic from either general neurologists who are in rural areas or internal medicine physicians or doctors, and just providing them with that knowledge and information that the person doesn't just need to have a tremor in order to be diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Those are the ones that I really miss when there aren't the classic Parkinson's symptoms or clinical findings. So having that connection and developing that early on. And once again, I understand when you do that, that means you're going to get more referrals in general, and they may not all be typical or classic or what you're actually looking for, but you should still develop the relationship. And also connecting with what we do here at Morehouse School of Medicine is we have a connection with a lot of the rural general neurologists, and especially Southern Georgia. So we try to allow them to let them know that we have various different options for their patients to see us because they may not want to drive. We may allow them to do a virtual visit, video visit, so we can allow them to be able to communicate with us through video, increasing their likelihood of being able to see a movement specialist.
It certainly sounds like you have some wonderful services in place that could potentially be replicated elsewhere, where you have the expertise and you're reaching out to both your internal medicine colleagues, your rural neurology colleagues. It sounds like This is something that should be publicized to the rest of neurology to figure out how to maximize the number of people seeing movement disorder specialists, etc. We have a couple questions here about other neurologic conditions. MS, multiple sclerosis, has been mentioned specifically, and wondering if there are lessons that we as a Parkinson community can take from understanding other neurologic diseases in the African American community. So one person asked specifically, it seems to me, or I assume, that there are more people of color diagnosed with MS than PD. And why is that? And can we take any lessons from that?
Yes, great question. I will say once again, at least when I looked back at this research before I did a mini grand rounds on this back in Boston. While they are more people who are diagnosed with MS, people of color, they still have a higher rate of complications, morbidity. So they're more advanced in their diagnosis of MS when they come to see the MS specialist or the specialist. So some of the stroke, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, you will see some of the same patterns. And that goes back again to, while there may be some biological and genetic factors, I think that there's a larger percentage of factors related to communication. And as I stated in the beginning, at the end of the day, race is a social construct. And so we have to understand that we don't want to look at everybody just like, okay, you have to have these symptoms in order to move forward to get to the referral to see the specialist in that particular specialty. But we have to treat everyone equally. So I know we're going to get to this question at some point. I'm jumping ahead of time, but looking at deep brain stimulation and the people being referred for DBS treatment is much higher among Caucasians compared to African Americans. And so the question is, well, maybe they have comorbidities that cause them to be contraindicated, meaning they cannot get the deep brain stimulation, but they have removed that from those studies. And they saw an 8 times less likely for African Americans to have DBS, deep brain stimulation, compared to Caucasians. So I think that while there may be genetic factors, I think we need to start looking at the social factors with communication and understanding of how to, as myself, as a provider, to communicate effectively to the patient.
Let's explore DBS right now. What is your experience with referrals of your patients for DBS? And we have one question coming in from Joseph. Do you see a different level of resistance from the African American community towards surgical procedures such as DBS or focused ultrasound? And could that be playing a role in the differential rates?
Great question. Yes. So through my personal experience or professional experience with referring patients, yes, correct. I do see African Americans with a different overall understanding of what deep brain stimulation means and what that looks like. And there is some hesitancy when you talk about deep brain stimulation because what they've heard is brain surgery. And so some patients are very hesitant to participate in that. That goes back again to communication and being able to have that discussion with that patient and not just saying, okay, they said no today. It's coming back when we're retitrating the same medications or there's continue to be fluctuation in the movements and problems with the movements. There was a study back in 2014 looking at the knowledge and attitudes about Parkinson's disease among a diverse group of older adults. And African Americans and Chinese Americans both had the same distrust. Well, African Americans had more of a mistrust or distrust to the healthcare system. Chinese Americans had more of a language barrier, and they both thought that generally it was associated with older age. But when you look at all of the prevalence and incidence studies, and it's definitely the rate of occurrence, Chinese Americans, they're both lower, the prevalence, the incidence, and the rate of occurrence, meaning that we don't see these issues or discrepancies despite having that same mindset about Parkinson's disease and it being more of just old age occurring. So there's still something else that we're missing. I want to be deliberate in being hesitant about pushing all of this onto the patient. At some point, as providers, myself included, I'll just talk about myself, I have to take the ownership of how that information is being delivered and what is being said. if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because we all know, as any clinicians listening, that you can say something in more than one way and you can know how the person is going to react based on how you say it. And that's a truth that you have to be very, very aware of. So thank you for that answer. So we have a number of questions that address this issue, which we haven't discussed yet, which is participation of African Americans in support groups and sort of educational programs, wellness programs, the type of thing that APDA does throughout the country. And so one question that we were asked was, why, when I look out in my support group, am I not seeing a rainbow of different color skins? Why am I seeing everybody who is white? And what can we do about understanding that phenomenon and changing it?
Yeah. So I tell you what I did. I came to Morehouse. I'm still on faculty at Boston University, and I went to medical school there and did my residency. And it's a great program, and we still do research and we work together very closely. We have to start to be intentional of being in the communities that we want to help or understand or to whatever our interests are. And I know that this is a very important to me, not just professionally, but also personally. And so I came to the institution where there was no movement disorder specialist, where there was no movement disorders clinic, to start to involve the patients and participants and people in the community at large. So we have to be intentional about where we're getting this information and how we are giving it or dispensing it to the community we're in. And honestly, that, once again, it's going to go back to a provider aspect. So if you're a patient listening to this with Parkinson's disease, then it's going to be harder for you to pull in your doctor's patients unless he can share that, or if he or she or the physician is okay with sharing that information with you. But at the end of the day, it's going to come back to the provider being more intentional. It's all trying to get people more involved. Once again, we've already looked at access to care. I know people are going to say, well, what about people not having services? I know a lot of the questions went around like being a part of virtual support groups and not being able to see people in virtual support groups, and does their internet access that's there. Most African Americans live in urban facilities and areas. Going back to that DBS research, you can't say it's an issue with access to care because urban hospitals and large cities are going to have a higher number of neurologists and neurosurgeons in that particular institution. So participation in support and educational groups was the reason why I joined Morehouse School of Medicine and why I'm a part of the APDA Grant for All, to try to engage people, but ask the question. 100% of the people that I did the survey with looking at the research for Parkinson's disease were never asked about PD research. Are we even asking, do you want to participate in the support group or this educational program? And then are we following up the week before the program is supposed to begin? Hey, is this a good time for you? We often work around our schedule, and that it happens, but the program will be at 12 o'clock on a Monday. And I live in Georgia, so some of the programs, so say, are in North Georgia. Is that an issue with transportation? Is there a transportation system that will go to that part of Georgia? Or is that for only people who can drive cars to that area? Is 12 o'clock on a Monday realistic for certain groups of people? Would 6 o'clock on a Saturday be better? That's going to, of course, cut into the time for the provider. But once again, are we being intentional about who we are trying to engage and be a part of these support groups and educational programs?
Okay, great. We have another question here from Angela. I would love to hear your thoughts on how to affect actionable change within different ethnic groups who are not seeking therapy for their PD. So I don't know if you've come across that, somebody who may have been given the diagnosis but is not pursuing all they can to help them, their PD.
Yeah, thank you again for that question. Great question. Once again, even the question, not seeking therapy, are they? Are they really not seeking therapy? They're clearly sitting in somebody's office. They're actually having a conversation about their diagnoses. There was a study did in, I think, 2009 by Dr. Douale, and it was treatment disparities in Parkinson's disease. They reported that African Americans were 4 times less likely than whites to receive any Parkinson's disease treatment, including physical therapy. And her study questioned, this raises concern for communication breakdown among the providers. It goes back to that discussion again. Are we not asking asking the question? Are we asking the question, or are the times for physical therapy not conducive to the community that we're asking them to do this? Or everybody that I've referred for physical therapy has gone. Everyone. Every time I talk about the current clinical trial that we're going to be partaking in, looking at exercise in Parkinson's, has been very interested.
That's a great take-home message today. We have another question here from Christopher. Do you have any recommendations for, and I think you answered this, but maybe we can flesh it out a tiny bit more, recommendations for increasing awareness of PD support and how to increase access to underserved communities? I think you pretty much answered that, which is to say you need to say it to the right people, and you need to be in the right communities to really get the feedback.
Yeah, let's say it's not possible. You try to make relationships in the communities that you want to be. So someone mentioned that they were in Chicago or Illinois, and there's a certain town or a certain area where you know there's a higher density population. It's making that relationship with either the general neurologist, ideally if they have one, or the internal medicine doctor. But not only making that connection and relationship, but also looking at the times that you're having these support groups. Certain communities have to work longer, so they may not be available on a Tuesday at 12 o'clock. So those are important as well, just being more mindful about other barriers that could be stopping people from participating.
We have another question here, which is, are you aware of research projects that include African Americans across the U.S.? So another way of saying that is, does your research project include people outside your medical center? And is there any thought of making this type of research more expansive in terms of geography?
Yes and yes. So my research does not right now at this point. We wanted to start within the city, and then we will expand that. Now, there was Dr. Allison Willis in 2009. She did do the title of her paper is Geographic and Ethnic Variation in Parkinson's Disease. That is most comprehensive, meaning they looked at the entire U.S., if I remember correctly, looking at the population and the prevalence and incidence of Parkinson's disease among African Americans, Caucasians, and I believe they include other ethnicities as well. But yes, I would like to expand the research that I'm doing here and continue my partnership at Boston University and the work that I am currently still doing there, and combining those relationships so that it'll be a more expansive research.
Excellent. I think we have time for one or two last questions. We have an excellent one here from Rosalind, which is, are you aware of a network of support for people of color who have PD?
No, I do not. And that is the difference. There was a question about MS. That is the difference. There are several different support groups that are geared only for certain diagnoses of patients with MS. And I'm not aware of that for Parkinson's disease that I know of.
Are you aware of effort in your clinic to create support groups among your clinic patients?
Absolutely. We're actually starting that. So we want to be intentional. So we want to include the patients and have them participate and actually possibly lead the support groups. So we're doing the training of a couple of people within the community, African American male who has deep brain stimulation, who's received DBS, and to lead in that participation. And then another support group where we can have people who have been diagnosed for less than 5 years. And so being intentional about who the faces that we see who are leading these support groups and who are being taught how to lead that. So yes, we are working on that currently.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, our time has come to a close, and we so much appreciate your insights into this fascinating topic. I think this conversation has given me a lot of hope, which is that with the right people, and you are one of them, spearheading this effort and speaking in the right communities to the right people, we can make a difference. And you're starting to do that in your community, and I really want to applaud you. Thank you for all your work. We're thrilled to be behind you at APDA.
And I just want to say everyone can do that. Everyone can start to have those questions and thinking about it and having other people participate in that discussion as well.
Absolutely. I think this conversation has given a lot of hope to listeners to realize that it just needs the people in the communities to organize and to share their thoughts with those who might be interested as well. So thank you for being inspiring to the rest of us. I want to highlight, first of all, again, to thank Dr. Branson for joining us today, and also to thank everyone who submitted questions and participated and listened. So thanks, everyone. I think that made a really robust conversation. And if you know somebody who missed today's program, if you would like to see it again, if you joined late, you can view a recording of this on our website at apdaparkinson.org. For additional information, for answers to your additional questions, for any additional resources, again, we do have this one-stop shopping at apdaparkinson.org. Please come and check us out, and you can also call us at 1-800-223-2732. So our next episode of Dr. Gilbert Hosts will be next month, Wednesday, January 13th at noon Eastern Standard Time. I will be speaking with David Leventhal, who will be speaking with me about Dance for PD. So that will be an interesting conversation, and I hope that everyone can join us for that as well. If you enjoyed today's webinar, we hope you will consider supporting APDA with a donation, because with your help, APDA can deliver more programs and services like this one, which we need now more than ever. And finally, I want to remind everyone to check out our APDA Symptom Tracker, which is an app that helps you or your loved one track their PD symptoms. The Symptom Tracker is available in English and Spanish and can be downloaded from the Apple Store or Google Play, so please check it out. And finally, thank you again for joining us today, and please join us for our next session of Dr. Gilbert Hosts, which is Dance for PD with David Leventhal, and you can visit our website, apdaparkinson.org, to register for that. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.